Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor James Otteson. Hello, James. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
I'm great, James. Today we will be discussing a brilliant philosopher and economist, Adam Smith. James, who was Adam Smith?
Well, Adam Smith is credited with having essentially founded the discipline of economics. He was a Scottish political economist and moral philosopher from the 18th century and was author of two important books. The first book is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which came out in 1759. And then the second and now much more famous book is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, often just called The Wealth of Nations, which came out in 1776. And that second book, The Wealth of Nations, is usually credited with being really the first book in what we would today recognize as being in the discipline of economics.
All right, James. People often refer to the wealth of nations, but tell us a little about the theory of moral sentiments. But before you do so, who were the major philosophical influences in the life of Adam Smith?
Oh, that's a good question. So his academic position was as a moral philosopher. So he was a professor of moral philosophy, which in the 18th century just meant that there were two main divisions of professors in the 18th century. You were either a professor of moral philosophy or a professor of natural philosophy. The natural philosophy was all the disciplines that we would today recognize as having to do with the natural non-human world. So everything from botany to astronomy to all of the sciences were called natural philosophy. Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, which had all the things to do with human behavior, studying human behavior. So everything that we would today recognize as from psychology to human anatomy, to politics, to moral philosophy proper, and also to economics.
All right. And who were some of the major philosophers in his life?
Yeah, so he was a close friend and confidant with David Hume. David Hume is perhaps the other great figure from the 18th century in Scotland, and they're both usually thought of as empirical philosophers, but they were friends, and Hume was an enormous influence on Adam Smith. But he was also well versed in many ancient philosophers, in particular Aristotle. So I would say Aristotle and David Hume were probably two of the most important influences on his thought.
What about some of his teachers and other philosophers, people he encountered as a student and as an academic? Like,
yes, so he studied with another Scottish philosopher named Francis Hutchinson. Francis Hutchinson was also very prolific and very well known at the time, and was actually the first person to formulate what we now recognize as one of the important aspects of utilitarian moral philosophy. So it was Francis Hutchinson who first came up with the formula of greatest good for the greatest number. That was Francis Hutchinson, and that was Adam Smith's his teacher. And one other thing that I would mention about Francis Hutchinson is that Hutchinson believed that we had something that he called a moral sense. So we have the normal five senses of seeing, touching, smelling, hearing, and tasting. But Hutchinson also thought we had what he called a moral sense, which was an ability to, as it were, perceive the moral facts about people, about individual people and their behavior and their actions. These were also very important influences on Smith.
yes, and in the realm of ethics, did Adam Smith have a preference? So for example, did he write on utilitarianism or deontology? What was his view on the popular ethical frameworks of his day?
That's a good question, and it's a bit hard to answer because Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is a little bit different. In fact, it's quite different from most of the moral philosophy that was being written in his time and before his time, in part because the question he set to himself to answer in that book is not so much what we might think of as moralism, so telling people how they ought to behave or how they ought not to behave. He does discuss the virtues, or at least some virtues, but the real purpose of that book was what intrigued Smith was what he observed in human behavior. In particular, he noticed that, it seemed to him anyway, all human beings go through developmental process of creating and then adopting moral sentiments. So when we're born as babies and as infants, we have no moral sentiments at all. We just have things we want and we cry out, we want somebody to satisfy them. But by the time we're adults, we have a very sophisticated sense of moral sensibility. So we develop a sense of what Smith called propriety, what is proper to ask for or improper to ask for, what's a proper or improper way to ask for things, what are proper and improper behaviors. So as adults, we have a very sophisticated sense of this moral propriety, but we don't have any sense at all as very small children, as infants. And what Smith was interested to know was what effectuated that change. How is it that we go from amoral infancy to highly moralized adulthood? And so the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is his attempt to explain that process. And so it's much more of an empirical and observational account than it is, him developing his theory of what actually constitutes moral rectitude or what really are the virtues. So he gives this historical and empirical story of the development of virtues, both in individual lives and then also in communities, that he intends to be subjected to empirical verification.
And how do virtues emerge?
So there are two ways to think about that question. It's a good question. Two ways to think about it. One is at the individual level. How do virtues emerge for an individual? How does an individual become virtuous? And then how do the virtues emerge for a community or a society? On the individual level, the key to the answer for Smith is he thinks a fixed feature of human nature is what he calls the desire for mutual sympathy of sentiments. So the word sympathy there he uses not to mean pity, but in its etymological sense of feeling with. So his idea is that human beings by nature, just built into our psychological construction, we receive pleasure when we realize that other people share our sentiments. So if we like a particular book or we like a movie or we approve of a person's character or behavior, we receive pleasure when we realize that other people that we care about share that judgment, that they also like what we like. And the prediction he makes is that if you think in your own life, what kinds of things matter to you? If politics matters to you, or if music matters to you, or literature, whatever it is that matters to you, you're probably going to seek out the company of other people who have similar sentiments to yours about those things that matter to you. So that's what he means by sympathy of sentiments. It's a concord or harmony. And what Smith thinks is that because we all receive pleasure from mutual sympathy of sentiments, this inclines us, it encourages us, it gives us a natural incentive to develop our own character, our own behavior, our own tastes and judgments, so that they are more likely to achieve this mutual sympathy of sentiments with people around us. So this is a developmental process, meaning that over time, we get better and better at predicting how other people will react to or will judge our own taste, our own sentiments, our own behavior. And we have a natural incentive to more closely align our behavior with what other people will expect of us. So it will turn out, because of this sort of mutual gravitation towards each other's behavior, that certain kinds of actions, certain categories of actions, certain, as we might call them, virtues, will emerge without any particular person intending it, but they emerge in the individual person's life, and then ultimately also in society as the kinds of behavior that are approved and the kinds of behavior that are disapproved. And Smith thinks that as an empirical matter, some of those approved and disapproved behaviors will be common across different cultures and nations and times. And so these things we might call virtues.
All right. James, I'm particularly interested in Smith's position on the soft virtues. So for example, Smith even wrote on love. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure, yeah. So love by itself is not a virtue per se, but it is something that Smith thinks is a key element of a truly happy or flourishing life. In other words, he thinks human beings are social animals by nature, that we will not be happy if we are all on our own. And one of the people he's probably contrasting his position with is Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French Genevan philosopher who was a rough contemporary of Smith and who had talked about a kind of idyllic life of a noble savage, a person living entirely on his own, not being dependent on anybody else for anything he wants or needs. Smith takes a different position. He thinks that's not actually how human beings are constructed to behave, and it's not a path to happiness for human beings. So Smith thinks that in order for us to be happy, we have to be with other people, and in particular, to be deeply happy, truly happy, or maybe even eudaimonically happy. That's to use Aristotle's word for eudaimonia, which means is often translated as happiness. To have true happiness, he thinks we have to be loved. And so Smith says that we not only desire to be loved, but we also, in addition to that, desire to be lovely. In other words, deserving of love from others. So that means that we strive, we're constructed almost to strive not only to find people whom we ourselves love, but also to behave and really be, to incorporate into our characters, ways of behaving that would warrant and maybe even attract love from other people. So love is an important part of human happiness. And this gives us further incentive, he thinks, to act in ways that we might consider to be virtuous as opposed to vicious, so that we are not only loved by others, but that we deserve to be loved.
Interesting. But was Smith critical of sexual love?
Didn't talk much about it. There is a little bit of discussion in the theory of moral sentiments about sexual appetite and sexual love, but the way he talks about it there, he says that when he's talking about the desire for mutual sympathy and the kinds of beliefs and tastes and preferences and value judgments that we express to others for which we would like to achieve mutual sympathy with other people. He says some of them are more likely to achieve sympathy with others than some other of our tastes and sentiments. And things like the food we like. I mean, this is what, he was writing in the 18th century, so these were his judgments. He said, if you talk too much about food, or if you talk too much about bodily needs, which would include sexual appetites, he said he claims most people are relatively put off by that. They're not really interested in those details about your life. And so we learn over time that that sharing those kinds of intimate details about our bodily needs, including our sexual behaviors or sexual tastes and preferences, not that there's something inherently morally wrong with them, but that they're just not the kinds of things that most people are likely to be interested in sharing a mutual sympathy of sentiments with us. So over time, we'll just come to regard those as being more matters of private, keeping them private conscience, private behavior, rather than expressing them to others.
Well, I agree with Adam Smith, but he resided in a different time. We're in the age of OnlyFans and social media, and I think that it is rather distasteful that people feel so happy about selling themselves, but that's a different story. But if Adam Smith were around today, I doubt he would appreciate our moral sentiments.
That's probably true, at least some of them. I mean, one of the things that has completely revolutionized our lives today is the pervasiveness of social media. And that's something, of course, Smith could not have predicted. As you said, he lived in a different time. He was in the 18th century. This was before the internet. It was before computers. It was before televisions, radios, telephones, even before electricity. So there was nothing like that in his day. And one of the interesting aspects of Smith's theory that might actually be applicable in an interesting way to the phenomenon of social media is that Smith thought that in order for us to develop our moral sentiments properly, we needed not only to express to other people our judgments and our tastes, etc., but other people's reactions to those things needed to have some purchase on us. In other words, we needed to get some feedback. If we got negative feedback, then this would encourage us to change our judgments or change our behavior. If we get positive feedback, then this encourages us to continue on in that behavior. One of the interesting implications of that Smith, of course, could not have anticipated with social media is that a lot of the expression of people's tastes and preferences, et cetera, in social media is anonymized, meaning they don't get they're not expressing it to a person with whom they're actually looking and seeing the reaction. And whatever response they get, they might be getting from people that they don't know. They could be getting them from complete strangers. So one of the things that Smith's theory might predict, and I guess we can decide for ourselves today whether this holds true, is that that will give rise to a distorted sense of moral sensibility. The more that we express our sentiments in anonymous fashion or to anonymous people, rather than having people physically in our presence, and then we can observe their reaction, the less good information we get as feedback to our sentiments, which means that we might see a much greater variety of extremes of expression. So people will, instead of being checked in their most extreme anger or outrage or condemnation or other kinds of behavior, instead of receiving the admonition that they would get if there were a person present there who would say something like, hey, you shouldn't say that, or maybe you should rethink that. We don't have those restraints because it's all anonymous. And so we indulge much more extreme behavior. I think that would be a prediction Smith would make. And I guess we can decide for ourselves whether that's actually coming true with social media.
Brilliant assessment, James. Let me give you my position on the OnlyFans controversy. I'm a libertarian, though I am religious. I am not a Puritan. Therefore, I do have a problem with business people who become intrusive and insert what I refer to as non-serious morality in their business model. So, for example, there's an ongoing scandal re OnlyFans. OnlyFans was actually unable to promote pornographic content because banks had a problem with the promotion of pornographic material. And my own view is that bankers are in the business of banking and making money. And if you're not in the business of trafficking people, then they shouldn't really be concerned about your proclivities. That's my personal opinion. Well, Adam Smith is not alive today, but how would he comment on an issue like this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question because it involves some speculation, obviously, since, as you say, Adam Smith is not alive now. And so we would have to, and these kinds of situations were pretty foreign and pretty alien to the kinds of things he was observing in the 18th century in Britain. But so it involves a little bit of speculation. But one thing I would say is that what Smith would anticipate that would go on in a commercial society or in a market economy is that people would be naturally incentivized to figure out ways to use their time, their talent, their treasure to benefit other people, and then in turn receive benefit from those other people. So if you think about the typical exchange in a market economy, they're mutually voluntary and then they're mutually beneficial. I offer you something, and if you agree to say the price of whatever I'm selling to you, if we exchange, that means that you must think that you benefited from your perspective. I think I benefited from my perspective. And that leads to a net increase, even if only an incremental one, in the total amount of prosperity we have in society. So that's sort of the standard account of how exchanges take place in a market economy. What Smith would argue is that, or I think he would argue, and again, this is a bit speculative, is that what people in a market economy want to do is to respond to other people's needs and preferences and other people's values. So if it turns out that you have a society in which customers or potential customers want their businesses to take moral stands, public moral stands or public political stands, and if they're actually allowing or making decisions about from whom to buy or with whom to work or associate or partner, et cetera, based on other people's political positions or other people's public moral stances, then I think Smith would say, well, what he would predict is that you would see businesses and business people and business enterprises responding to that. And that might be good or bad, but I think he would say he would take a more empirical view of it and just say, well, what they're doing is they're just responding to what people want. And even if that means that, it's a difficult judgment if you're a business person. I mean, imagine being, the CEO of a large company, and you know that there are hot button issues where people are sharply divided, but some proportion of your clientele or your potential clientele wants you to make a strong statement about a particular public issue, moral issue, or political issue. But you know that, so if you do, you might please those constituents, but if you don't, if you do, you might please those constituents, but at the same time, you might alienate others. That's a very difficult judgment. I think what Smith would suggest is that you will see these fashions come and go, but ultimately, as people's sentiments change, those things will sort themselves out. So I think he was relatively optimistic that yes, you would see fashions come and go, but ultimately the purpose of business and the purpose of engaging in business activity in a market economy is still to provide benefit to other people. And so in the long run, you would still see the benefit coming through.
Again, a lucid response, but I slightly disagree with Smith. But then again, he's dead, so we cannot really predict his views
Right.
accurately. But my own view is quite simple. There is a business model, and political correctness is not really a part of the business model. If I'm purchasing a phone, I care about the quality of the phone.
Yeah.
The views of the CEO in relation to BLM or capitalism or the LGBT movement is not my business.
Yeah, no, I understand the sentiment, and you can see that at work in other areas too. I mean, think about if you have a plumbing problem in your house and you call a plumber, you're probably not going to care about what the plumber's politics are or what the plumber thinks about any of these issues that you mentioned. You just want a good plumber. Similarly with medicine, if you go to a medical doctor, if you have a medical condition, you go to a medical doctor, you don't care about what the medical doctor's politics are. You want to know, is this person a good medical doctor? And we might say something similar. Maybe this is what you have in mind. We might say something similar about most of the things, the goods and services we buy in a market economy. What we want are things that that satisfy our needs, satisfy our preferences, that actually solve problems for us. We don't want, we're not so much concerned about what the politics or moral stances on any of these kinds of issues are of the people who are selling us those things. And it seems like that's the argument you're making. And you might also, the argument has been made, and maybe this is also your view, although I don't want to put words in your mouth. But some people have argued that to the extent that a business begins to pay attention to things other than just providing a good service or providing a good product, if it's paying attention to other things, then that might, at least at the margins, begin to compromise its ability to actually create and provide those good products and those good services at a good price, et cetera. So it might actually be diminishing the quality of goods and services, or maybe raising their prices as businesses move to pay attention to other things. So this could be perhaps unintended, but nevertheless a negative consequence.
I call it the opportunity cost of political correctness, and I have an article under this name. It was published by the Mises Institute. When businessmen and women divert their energies to solving political problems, it clearly means that they're not investing time to improve the user experience.
Yeah, and I think there is a long-standing argument. Well, I don't know how long-standing. I mean, if you think about Milton Friedman's famous article, which came out, I believe, in 1972, that was entitled "The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Its Profits." In that article, one of the claims that he makes is that there's an important distinction between political processes on the one hand and business on the other hand. And there are, in fact, several different important differences. But one of them is that, as Friedman argues anyway, that in business, in markets, the principle that underlies what they do is what he called unanimity, meaning there is no exchange, there is no partnership or hiring relationship. There's nothing that goes on that's not unanimous among all the parties to it. So if you and I don't both agree unanimously that we want to buy or sell a product or work together, then it won't happen. By contrast, in politics, what you have is a principle not of unanimity, but rather a principle of conformity, because whoever wins the election, then the rest of us just have to do whatever that politician or that administration or that legislature decides to do. We no longer have the right to opt out. For that reason, and maybe this is partly what you're thinking, for that reason, Friedman argues that what we should carefully distinguish those things and be careful about what we ask each of those kinds of activities to do. if we want to have particular political views, or maybe public moral views expressed in our political institutions, then that's a political process, but that's not a business process. The business process is to make goods and services that improve our lives and increase our prosperity. And the extent, to whatever extent we mix those two, we might be compromising both of them.
I agree, and remember, James, businesses do good by doing well. If a firm is not profitable, then it cannot invest in charities or finance research. So if you are serious about increasing social value, you must produce economic value.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that sometimes gets lost in various kinds of discussions about politics and economics or about business is that as a political goal, or maybe as a moral goal, we think about things like solving poverty. We want to help people rise out of poverty. But of course, the antidote to poverty is prosperity. And so we tend to think about how should we redistribute wealth. We sometimes spend comparatively less attention thinking about how to produce wealth. What are the institutions that enable us to produce the wealth that we might want to redistribute, or that we might want to use to address various problems with poverty. But if we keep in mind that the real antidote to poverty is prosperity, then that means that we definitely still we can't solve any of the problems we might face if we don't have the wealth and prosperity to do so.
Yeah, so for example, in America, especially in left-leaning circles, people talk about regulating big businesses, especially big tech, but they do not say in order to facilitate or expand the capital formation, especially in low-income areas, maybe we need to limit the powers of regulation, because regulations impede business formation. So there's a tendency to view wealth as a zero-sum game.
Yes, that's a good point. And I wanted to mention it. So I just came out with a book that's called 7 Deadly Economic Sins. And one of the economic sins I identify and talk about in the book is exactly the one you mentioned, that wealth creation is a zero-sum game. So people tend to think that that there is a fixed amount of wealth in the world. And that if one person becomes wealthy, suppose you become a billionaire, the only way you could have done that is by taking wealth from other people. And so, in other words, you become wealthy at other people's expense. But that doesn't capture the reality of a market economy. In a market economy, the way one person gets wealthy is by providing value and benefit to other people. So wealth is not zero sum. There are cases of it, of course. If you think about some of the big civilizations of the past, and you think about the Egyptian pharaohs and their pyramids, or the Roman Empire, or the Song dynasty in China, how did they get that wealth? Well, they got it by slavery, colonialism, theft, etc. So those really are ways of enriching yourself, but at someone else's expense. That's a process of extraction. But in a market economy, one of the beautiful aspects of a market economy is that the way to become wealthy is not at someone else's expense, but with someone else. So we're making each other better off at the same time.
Well, James, people tend to conflate mercantilism or national wealth with individual wealth. When we say a country is rich, we're looking at the per capita income, the quality of life indicator, and basically social indicators of development. So the literacy rate, etc., the level of equality, gender differences. We're not really arguing that a country is rich because the GDP is huge. And historically, we have not you, but persons have said the Mughal Empire was prosperous. No, it was not. Based on GDP, the Mughal Empire was successful, but when we take a long-term view, the Mughal Empire was just like any other mercantilist empire. It did not induce mass-based flourishing, so people often mischaracterize wealth creation. When we say that a country is rich, we're referring to sustained economic growth and development in living standards, not GDP.
Yeah, and GDP, focusing on GDP has all sorts of problems. It doesn't speak to the well-being of any particular citizen in a country, and it also doesn't address how the wealth was accumulated or where it came from or how it was generated. So it's at best a very weak signal. It is a signal, but it's a weak signal, and it could admit of all sorts of different interpretations and explanations for the wealth. But I agree with you. I think that what we should be concerned about is the actual well-being of the citizens in a society, and that's something that we can't capture only, as you say, by focusing on GDP. There are many other ways, things that we can look at. But many of the problems, sort of the endemic problems, if you think about, traditionally speaking, food, clothing, shelter, those are sort of the main things that we talk about people as being people's basic needs: food, clothing, and shelter. There are many others as well: healthcare, for example, maybe medicine, et cetera, maybe education. Maybe all of those things contribute to a life well lived, a life of meaning and purpose. But in an interesting way, I think all of those can be a function of widespread wealth, meaning the more wealth individuals have in a community, in a society, in a country, the more able they are to improve their lives on all of those various margins, and then give themselves a better chance at leading a life of meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And the economic literature is quite clear. Economic freedom predicts growth and well-being.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think Smith got right, and I think he should be given credit for. So in The Wealth of Nations, one of the things that Smith argues is that each person possesses localized knowledge, meaning you know about your situation, you know your values and preferences and the constraints and obstacles and opportunities you face better than any other person does about you. And I know the same for me, and each individual has this localized knowledge about him or herself. So Smith says, if you want to enable growing prosperity, and in particular, enable people who are poor to rise out of poverty, to improve their conditions, improve their circumstances, the default position should be to trust them to figure out how to do that on their own. So you protect their persons, you protect their property, you protect the contracts and promises they made, and otherwise interfere very little in their own activity. And then people will all on their own begin to figure out ways to improve their conditions in ways that a legislator or a statesman, as Smith says, would never be able to do, because the legislator and statesmen simply don't possess the knowledge of the localized situation that the individuals do about their own case. So his very famous invisible hand argument is that in a well-governed society that protects people's persons, their property and possessions, and then also enforces their voluntary agreements and contracts, but doesn't do much else, will enable people to the opportunity to find out ways to improve their own conditions by improving the conditions of other people. And so prosperity will begin to increase because of all of this decentralized activity of individuals, and it doesn't need to be superintended by the philosopher or the statesman from afar.
And again, some in the libertarian and conservative communities often respond to critiques of market failure, but my retort is quite average. It's obvious. Market failure isn't a problem. Capitalism works because markets show us what can be done and what cannot be done. So obviously, failure is one of the keys to doing well. So the market failure objection to capitalism is not really convincing. I'm not moved.
Well, and one thing to point out also is that human beings are flawed. We are imperfect. There is no such thing as a perfect system. And so because of that, I think what we have to do is not to compare one system of political economy, whatever system we want to think of, to a standard of ideal perfection, because that's not possible. Instead, what we should do is compare actually available alternatives and look at which are relatively better and which are relatively worse. And there, I think we can make considerable headway. And I think you're right that the evidence is very strong that that market economies based on private property outperform and enable far more people to rise, to improve their conditions than virtually any other system we've been able to come up with.
Yes, and we know this because of the Economic Freedom of the World report produced by the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation also as a similar publication. And several books have been written on the topic. So, for example, Sweden became rich because of pro-market reforms, not socialism. Sweden could finance the welfare state because it was affluent.
That's right. I mean, in order to have large scale, widespread institutions of redistributing wealth, you have to have the wealth first. And countries like the Scandinavian countries and the United States have generated an enormous amount of wealth because of market institutions that enable them to do that, and that's what enables them to sustain these kinds of programs.
And market institutions enable innovation, and innovations explain long-term economic growth. The state is often a barrier to innovation. I don't share the view that the state has played an efficient role in commercializing products. This, even if the state sponsored research, the private sector is more adept at allocating research.
Yeah, that's a hot topic right now, as you must know. So
Yes,
there are many economists, Mariana Mazzucato.
advocator, yes.
Yes, so she's one of them who has argued that the state actually has played historically, and then she also advocates it could play an important role in directing in innovation and directing and guiding entrepreneurship, et cetera. That I think is something that Adam Smith would be very skeptical of, primarily because the state agents, so people in the national government, simply aren't in possession of the knowledge of individual people's situations or of the future, what they'll need in the future, in a way that individuals themselves are. So one way to think about that is, suppose you have some proposal for maybe an example, as Matsukata has several examples of states funding various kinds of research. And if they fund various kinds of research, and sometimes that research leads to good results, so something good was discovered. Even if we stipulate that a particular example does lead or has led to a good result, that by itself doesn't justify having done it or doing it again. And the reason is because you don't know what the contrast class is. You don't know, you have to ask the sort of quintessential economist question, which is compared to what? In other words, what would have happened had the state not done that? Is it possible that those same resources could have led to other kinds of discoveries, or more quickly led to those same discoveries, or done other kinds of things that would have generated even more value and more benefit than what we identified? And until you can make at least a good faith estimate there and a good faith comparison, you can't yet justify a particular state intervention. So just saying that it's good doesn't mean it's good enough. You have to show that it's better than the alternatives, and that's much harder to do.
Yeah, counterfactuals are very difficult to understand. And I am paying close attention to the debate. I've been following Mariana Mazzucato for a long time. I have read some of her critics who are affiliated to the Cato Institute and the Midas Institute. And based on my perusal of the data, it is evident that business incubator programs and R&D programs are really exceptional under rare circumstances. On average, they're not successful.
Yes, and I also have been following that debate, and I think that the kinds of results that you're mentioning are exactly what people like Adam Smith would have predicted. And I think you would go back to, I mean, yes, he was writing 250 years ago, but I think he would go back to the idea of local knowledge. People from afar simply can't know. It's very difficult for them to predict, maybe impossible for them to predict what would actually be a good result. And that's true, by the way, that's also true for individuals and even individual businesses. Businesses have a very hard time knowing what products, services, et cetera, and at what prices will actually be successful in the market and will actually provide people things that they want. But in a situation when you have that kind of pervasive uncertainty, I think the Smithian recommendation would be what you need is many different kinds of experiments. So thousands, millions of different kinds of experiments, trial and error, including failure and learning from failure. That's the only way to actually figure out what the best use of our limited and scarce resources is. And making centralized decisions about them are much less likely to actually achieve the results we want than if we had millions of experiments going on.
James, at some point, I expected you to mention the great mind fallacy, because this is what we're really discussing.
Yes, so I wrote a paper, now it's about 10 years ago, called Adam Smith and the Great Mind Fallacy. And that's connected here. So the great mind fallacy that I think Adam Smith, that's my phrase, but I think it's building on Adam Smith's argument. So Adam Smith talks about a person he calls the man of system. And the man of system, according to Smith, is the person who thinks that he can devise a comprehensive plan for society, including all the people in society, and put them all in their proper places according to this beautiful plan. And if all the people and all the pieces in the beautiful plan played their proper role according to the plan, then you would have an ideally good, or at least an approximation of an ideally good society. Smith says that these kinds of plans never work. And the reason they don't work is because each person in society has, as Smith says, a principle of motion all his own. In other words, each of us is a free and autonomous agent who makes decisions that are unpredictable, that other people can't anticipate. We respond to things in all sorts of ways in real time to unpredictable circumstances. So there's no way to get people to actually follow your perfect plan, no matter how beautiful it is in theory. And the great mind fallacy that I argue is that a lot of policy that's proposed, a lot of policy proposals could only achieve their hoped for or their promised good results if you had some great mind who actually knew all of the variables and factors and all of the individuals who are making decisions in society, who knew all of that information and could act on it in real time. But because there is no such great mind, there is no person like this. Maybe God is, but God's not running for office. So putting God aside, there's no human being who possesses that knowledge. There is no human being who has a great mind. So any comprehensive plan like that is bound to fail. And so the great mind fallacy, as I call it, is to think either that there is such a great mind when there isn't, or it's to propose policies that could be successful or achieve their promised results only if such a non-existent personage actually were there.
James, God is not really a good example. I don't know if you're a religious person, but based on my philosophical reading of the Bible and my analysis of St. Augustine, God believes in the will. Therefore, if man has a free will, he can make errors. So I doubt that God, even though he's great, would tell us what to do. He's not an activist God. So a government, exactly.
Yeah. No, good point. So when I said maybe God could do it, but what I meant by that is that on at least some conceptions of God, and my own, I am a religious person, but one of the aspects of God traditionally understood is that God is omniscient. So God knows all of us and all of our preferences, our innermost thoughts, etc. So if you had an omniscient person, maybe that person could construct some kind of plan that would enable us to achieve the good, maybe even perfectly achieve the good in society. But that does not address the issue that you raise, which is whether it's morally appropriate to override people's free will. So no, I'm entirely in agreement with you that that God thought it was morally superior to create beings that had free will, fully knowing that they would sometimes make decisions that he might not like, or that weren't good decisions, that maybe they would engage in vicious activity, indulge various vices, not always be virtuous. But I think there is an important moral claim there that to be a moral agent at all means that you must have the ability to choose otherwise. If you're only doing what you're told, or only doing, and by what you're told, that could mean what another person tells you to do, or maybe if there's some kind of internal code, like a DNA code, you're constructed in a certain way, like a machine, where you only do certain activities because that's how you're built. those things are not moral agents. You're not being a moral agent. But in order to be a moral agent, in order to be able to take credit for your successes and then also responsibility for your failures, you have to be able to choose. And I think that on many conceptions of God, not all of them, but on many of them, and my own as well, human beings are moral agents. And so they have to be respected as moral agents. And part of what that includes and entails is that they are able to make choices even when we know they'll make the wrong choice.
Exactly. So, for example, the late philosopher J.L. Mackie said, how can a good God allow evil? And my response is this: in a world without evil, this world would be guided by deontological ethics. And in the world of deontology, we will not be in a position to appreciate good or even bad. So the flaws are innately constructed in these responses. In a world where there is no evil, there can be no standard to justify good.
Yes, and there wouldn't be any moral standard at all. So, I mean, if you think about non-human animals, if a dog attacks a human being, we don't morally blame the dog. We don't give the dog a lecture about moral virtue because we don't consider a dog to be a moral agent that's rationally and autonomously choosing what it's doing. By contrast with human beings do make choices, and they always, no matter what they decide to do, they could always have chosen otherwise, which means they are moral agents, which means they are and can be and should be held responsible for their choices. And I think that's what creates morality. Without it, there isn't any morality. It doesn't even make sense to talk about moral judgments unless you're talking about beings that are capable of choosing. And if they're not capable of choosing, or if they're not allowed to choose, then that robs them of the moral salience of their either their identities or their choices. And I mean, you can think about this in areas of policy as well. If I'm forced to help another person, then I get no moral credit for it. I only get moral credit if I'm doing the right thing by my own choice. And if I'm not doing it by my own choice, either because I'm being forced or because I don't have the capacity to choose, then I'm not a moral agent at all.
And then, James, why don't people account for the role of perception? Perceptions are important. And if we do not have standards of good and evil, we cannot appreciate development and progress.
No, that's right. And so if your question is why don't people understand that we have to be able to perceive right and wrong and make choices in order to be able to make progress in our own lives and other people's lives? Is that your question?
Yes, and it's also a comment.
Yes, well, I think many people, and I'm speaking very broadly now, but many people, including philosophers and maybe some economists, they don't focus so much on moral progress for an individual. What they're thinking about is what would an ideally good society look like? Or what would a much improved society look like? And if I can construct an idea or image of that in my mind, then the conclusion that's reached is, well, we should figure out how to achieve it. And what that can lead, at least some people, to when they're constructing the process, the steps in order to achieve the morally good society that they endorse, they aren't thinking or recognizing human beings as being as having individual dignity, maybe as created in the image and likeness of God, or whatever other source you might think human dignity comes from. What they're thinking of them is more like pieces of a puzzle or parts in this overall mechanism to achieve the good. And so we just think of them as maybe as relatively undifferentiated or even interchangeable units that can be arranged or put into a plan that can achieve the good. So I think people are focusing on the ultimate good that they can achieve, maybe the ultimate good of society, and less on the individuals that are going to make it up and the respect that individuals deserve as having their dignity.
Wow, interesting points. Since we're on the topic of justice, James, how did Adam Smith perceive justice?
Oh, it's a good question. So in the theory of moral sentiments, he talks about justice as being one of his four main virtues. And he has what he calls, this is his term, a negative conception of justice. So for him, there are two broad categories of virtues. And if you want to be fully virtuous, you first have to restrain yourself, refrain from making other people worse off, injuring or harming others. That's the first step. And then the second step to be fully virtuous is you have to engage in various positive activities to improve both your own and others' situations when you can and where you can. The first category, the restraint, that's what he calls justice. So he says that justice, you are acting fully justly if you are not harming or injuring another person. And he gives only 3 rules of justice. He calls them the sacred laws of justice. But he says to act with justice, what you have to do is, first of all, you have to respect other people's what he calls persons, meaning do not assault them, do not enslave them, do not kill them. That's the first step. Second rule is you have to respect their property. You have to respect their property and possessions. So you don't steal their property. You don't defraud them out of it. You don't trespass, despoil, etc. their property. You don't use their property without their permission. And then third, we have to respect the sanctity of contracts and voluntary promises. So if you and I enter into an agreement, each of us is bound to that, and each of us then is required to hold up his end of the agreement. That's all that justice requires for Smith. So he somewhat provocatively says, it's possible to fulfill all the rules of justice by sitting still and doing nothing. So if you're not assaulting anybody, if you're not stealing from anybody, if you're not making false promises that you don't intend to keep, then you're acting fully justly. So his theory of his conception of justice is very minimal, and that he calls it negative because it just means refraining from making other people worse off. Then the other aspect of virtue for him, the positive aspect, that's all of the things that we are required by virtue to do to improve not only our own, but other people's lives, which are things like through friendship and generosity and charity. All of those things are things that we should undertake personally, or maybe with other people who voluntarily want to join with us in our efforts. But all of those things that he calls under the general name of beneficence, so making other people better off, beneficence, that comes only after you are just. So there's no amount of beneficence that you can engage in that would enable you or justify you in breaking the rules of justice. The rules of justice come first, and once you have internalized those into your character, then you move on to the rules of beneficence, or the rules of generosity, friendship, charity, etc.
And is there a relationship between Smith's position on sympathy and justice?
Good question. It's not directly related, although I mean that's a bit of a complicated discussion. So the notion of sympathy, the mutual sympathy of sentiments, is what for Smith in an individual person enables you as it develops, as you grow from an infant to a child to a teenager to an adult. You develop a growing sense of what constitutes the unbreakable rules of justice, because when you break one of these rules of justice, other people harshly condemn you. You get very strong and very negative feedback for it, and that habituates us over time to internalize these rules into our conduct. So things like stealing from other people becomes a very strong rule, and it doesn't have to be that it's written down. It doesn't, even if it's, whether it's respected in the public institutions or not, just our exchanges with other people, our interactions with other people over time, because no one wants to be stolen from. These things become very deep parts of our character. He thinks just empirically. That's how he thinks we come to this notion of justice.
All right.
But, so that does arise from ultimately from the desire for mutual sympathy of sentiments, as he thinks the other virtues do as well.
All right then, and now we're going to be talking about your book, 7 Deadly Economic Sins. You listed the fallacy of wealth creation being a zero-sum game. Now you can tell us about the other 6 sins.
Well, yeah. So I come up with 7. There are probably more than just 7. But there are 7 main ones, and as we mentioned a second ago, the first one is the idea that wealth creation is by itself a zero-sum game. It's not necessarily zero-sum. It can be positive sum, But there are several others. And another one is connected with something else we discussed a minute ago, which is the idea that good is good enough. So good is not by itself is not good enough. It's not enough just to show that what you're thinking about doing is actually could actually lead to a good result. You have to show that it's actually better than than the other available opportunities to you. And maybe I'll just mention one or two others. Another one is something else we've already discussed, which is the idea of the great mind. There is no great mind. We tend to think that that organizing our resources, our time, our talent, and treasure, or maybe all the resources we have in society, in whatever way we think they ought to be organized, we tend to think that there is some person, maybe some expert, who possesses the relevant knowledge to be able to do that. When there isn't any such person, so there is no great mind. And maybe I'll just mention one other one.
The progress is inevitable fallacy.
That's exactly the one I was thinking of. So I think many people think, especially today, if you're living in a place like the United States, for example, and if you're a relatively young person, what has wealth done during your lifetime? Well, it's done nothing but increase. I mean, yes, there have been some downturns. There was the 2008, 2009 Great Recession. But there's always the next iPhone that's coming out. There's always the next innovation. There's enormously more wealth in the world today than there was even 40 years ago, let alone 140 years ago. And so people can come to have the view that progress and prosperity, the growth and prosperity, is just inevitable. Basically, no matter what we do, no matter what kinds of policies we have about trade or about taxation, that prosperity and wealth are going to increase regardless. And that, I think, is a very dangerous view to have, because wealth and prosperity are, first of all, very recent in human history, but they're also very fragile. They are dependent on having the right kinds of institutions that enable human beings to create wealth and prosperity. And those institutions can be destroyed utterly, or they can be slowly decayed to the point where your progress can actually slow, maybe stagnate, and maybe even revert. So I think it's very important for us to think about increasing prosperity, which should be the goal that we would all have. Is something that has to be nurtured and encouraged and rewarded by the right kinds of institutions. And if we don't do that, we won't have any more.
Progress is hard to create, but easy to degrade. Japan experienced a miraculous economy during the 80s, and by the 90s it petered out. That's actually the norm in history, not the exception.
Oh no, exactly right. And one interesting way to think about this is, if you think about Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations, as I mentioned at the beginning, the full title of it is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. But what's interesting about there, one interesting thing about that title, is that the book is not about it's not an inquiry into the nature and causes of the poverty of nations. That's a telling thing. So for Smith, what is required to be poor? To be poor, all you have to do to be poor is literally nothing. If you don't do anything at all, you will be poor. So that's not what requires explanation. What requires explanation and investigation is, what are the causes of wealth? That's the thing that's difficult, that for most of human history we did not have, that we've only very recently in human history had, and then even more recently, as you suggest, in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we've seen examples of places that began to generate, that went from extremely poor to extremely wealthy, like Hong Kong, for example. And there are other places that have endangered and jeopardized their wealth creation, and in some places might even be reversing it. And I guess Hong Kong could potentially be an example of that. We'll have to see what happens in the future with Hong Kong and its relation to mainland China.
Yes, and good examples are Venezuela and Chile. So most people are not familiar with the data, but originally economic freedom was a big deal in Venezuela. And when the government started to degrade the quality of economic freedom, the economy declined.
Yes, it did. And what we see in Venezuela unfolding before our eyes is a human tragedy on a very large scale. And that is, you're right, a great example of how a country can go from having very good institutions mean, Venezuela has enormous natural resources, including oil and gas, enormous natural resources, but having the wrong kinds of institutions have pretty quickly reversed their citizens' ability to actually capitalize on those resources, and now has almost completely completely reversed the economic progress it was making before. And you mentioned Chile. Chile is an example that is a good contrast to that. You can go from a relatively poor place that has natural resources. If you have the right kinds of institutions, then prosperity can ensue after that. So getting the institutions right is crucially important. Having the citizens have the right kinds of views towards one another. So in Smith's language, having internalized into their characters the respect for other people's persons, property, and promises, and then having institutions that respect those things as well. That can lead just about anywhere in the world, if you have those kinds of institutions and the right kinds of attitudes, to increasing prosperity. But you get rid of those or endanger those or jeopardize those, then the prosperity can be turned off almost like a spigot.
All right, James, I'm enjoying the conversation, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. It was a pleasure to speak to you, James. Bye.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right then, bye.
Bye-bye.